Well, good morning, everybody. I am not Pastor Brent. I am not Pastor Steve. I am much, much younger than they are. But they are better looking than me, so I'll give them that. My name is Bob Blake. If you don't know, I'm the youth pastor here at Lake Magdalene United Methodist Church. And it's my privilege to be in front of you this morning, and so thank you very much. Counterculture. Love thy neighbor. Like we talked about in the 9:30 service, I think all of Jesus' teachings were very, very counterculture. It went against the norm of the day. It goes against the norm today. And we've heard that so often. That one saying a lot in our lives is, love thy neighbor. We hear it all the time, and we're like, oh, we're neighborly, and we go knock on doors, and we maybe mow a person's yard once in a while. But what does it mean truly from a radical sense is to love your neighbor? Who is our neighbor? So that's what we're going to kind of tackle today as I take my glasses off. So even if you live under a rock, over the past few years you heard of crimes, speeches, statements that were based on division. These come from all kinds of areas and from all kinds of people, from the streets of the cities all the way to the presidential race itself. It seems that the culture, or the popular way we do things today in our times, is to hate or be against anything that is different from us. But that is how we should act as Christians. No, absolutely not. That's not how we should act as Christians. We are going to take a look at what Jesus has to say about the culture. A lot of things he taught were definitely counter to how the culture worked back then, as well as how it works today. Jesus lived in a time that was not too different from today. People, no matter what the era they lived in, they still dealt with the same basic problems as we do today. It's just the manner in which they approach them changes. The way we handle things today are a little bit different, maybe a little bit more severe. I don't know. This morning we're going to ask the question, who is my neighbor? And more importantly, how should I treat my neighbor?
When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees with his reply, they met together to question him again. One of them, an expert in the religious law, tried to trap him with this question. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments.
The religious leaders of Jesus' time were always trying to find a way to trap him into some kind of contradiction so they could arrest him, and this day was no different. The question they asked him was, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus first responds with the greatest commandment, to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. That would have satisfied the leaders, but in Jesus' fashion, he took it a step further. He said that loving your neighbor was equally important. So what does that mean? Fortunately, it's a very famous story you all know that illustrates this point.
Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same.
Luke, the author of this gospel, is telling the same account that Matthew did, but he includes something really important. He includes the part about asking about loving your neighbor. He included that part. Matthew did not. One of the leaders heard Jesus and asked what he meant simply by neighbor. So Jesus sought to explain its parable. A lot of Jesus is saying in our parables, stories that teach us everyday terms, and these parables always go deeper than what's on the surface. So let's take a closer look at what Jesus is saying in this parable. Some bullet points here. In the beginning, a man was traveling from Jericho to Jerusalem. We know that. Back then, this was a rough side of town. The road was dangerous. It was very hilly and rocky, and robbers had an easy place to hide, jump, and attack, and it happened quite often. The man is robbed, he's beaten, and left for dead. He thinks he has help coming, and he sees two men approaching him, especially since one of the men he saw was a priest. Priests had to be careful following the rules back then. They could not be unclean, especially when they were heading to the temple. So probably a good excuse maybe had the priest had. It's like, I can't touch this man. I've got to stay clean. I've got to go to the temple. I can't be burdened with this. So he walks around him, the other side, in order to stay clean, and does nothing and leaves the man for dead. We have a Levite. He's like a temple assistant. He also walks by and does the exact same thing the priest does. By now, the man is probably losing hope, losing consciousness. Nobody seems to want to help him. But in rides our hero of the story, and here is where the people of Jesus' time would have lost their marbles with this. Because we know that Samaritans hated Jews and Jews hated Samaritans. Samaritans were a group of people that were despised by Jews mainly because they were different. Focus on that, because they were different. Samaritans were Jews who had come from one of the 12 tribes, who had intermarried with people around the area, so they were considered half-breeds because they were not fully Jewish. So they were despised and hated. That priest hated that Samaritan who was about to help him. This Samaritan wrapped the man's wounds, took him to the inn to recover, and even paid his bill. This is the man Jesus says was the neighbor to the one who was beaten up. So what about us? What can we take from this parable? I'd like to focus on 3 points this morning, what we can take from this parable. Number one, being a neighbor means we have to get dirty. There's an old saying, you will always get dirty when you deal with people's messes. In order to help someone, you have to step into their problems to help them. You can't be on the periphery. You've got to get dirty and get in their mess. That's what people do when we help, when we love somebody. We get in their mess to help them. There's not a single person who does not have problems. There's not a single person in this sanctuary today that doesn't have problems. We all live with messes in our lives. And sometimes we need someone to get dirty with us. We all need that neighbor willing to do that, don't we? The priest and Levite in the parable were too afraid of getting dirty. Didn't want to deal with the man's problems. They had their own agenda. They had their own business. I have to get somewhere. I'm so busy. I don't have time for this. What would people think if they saw me helping this person who is different from me? And they thought they had really good reasons. They justified it because one was on his way to temple and couldn't be unclean, and the other one probably had very similar thoughts too. I'm a Levite. I'm better than him. Somebody else will come along. Somebody else will take care of him. Not my business. The Samaritan chose to get dirty. He saw a guy who was literally laying there hurting, and he stepped into his mess to help him. We all live busy lives, I know that, between family stuff, church activities, school, sports, hobbies, jobs, and all the other responsibilities we have. We are constantly on the go. And side note, the enemy loves that we're on the go. We're so distracted, then we can't focus and serve and help others and be that neighbor because we're so busy. The Samaritan was a good neighbor because he stopped. He stopped and helped. And he was willing to get into the life of the man. He didn't care who he was, where he came from. It was a man in need. That's all it was to him. Jesus calls for us to be neighbors to those in need, to step into their problems and not be afraid to get a little dirty. The second thing I think the parable is trying to teach us is being a neighbor means we have to sacrifice. The Samaritan was also a neighbor to the beaten man because he gave some of the things he had in order to help. The Samaritan gave up his abilities, He soothed the wounds of the man, bandaged him up. I don't know about you. I don't know a lot about medicine. But fixing it up probably wasn't easy on a side of a road that was dirty and messy. Back then, it was probably not an easy thing to do. The Samaritan also was willing to give up his money. He also talked about wine and oil he had with him. That stuff's not cheap back then. That was a huge sacrifice. It's not like us giving up half of our sandwich to somebody or something like that. It means giving up everything that he had with him. When he paid for the inn, the money that cost for the inn was 2 days' wages for this Samaritan man. 2 days worth of wages. And he was willing to come back a week later and go, if it went over that, I will help pay for the rest of it. That's sacrificing. We know sacrifice is not easy, but this is why Jesus is so countercultural to today. He takes what society tells us to do and he turns it on its head. This morning we had the high schoolers here and we had the graduation and the commission, and I told the teenagers, so often what they hear, and I think a lot of us hear also from today's world, it's all about instant gratification. It's all about me. Do what makes you feel happy. If you have to get ahead in that corporate ladder, step on somebody to do it. It doesn't matter. It's about you. It's about making money. It's about me, me, me. Jesus is teaching us as Christians. It's counterculture, everything he believes in. It's not about me. It's about others. It's about serving. It's about getting dirty, and it's about sacrificing. The third thing, being a neighbor means you have to love. As we said before, the Jews and the Samaritans were not best of friends. If the Samaritan had left a man to die, no one would have probably batted an eye. It was expected. When the Samaritan saw the man, Jesus says he had compassion for him. That is loving your neighbor, is the having that compassion element to it. He had compassion for him. Where the others went out of their way to move around to the other side of the road and avoid the beaten man, Jesus says the Samaritan went right over. Didn't casually look over, he went right to the man. He saw the need, he saw somebody, he saw a neighbor, and he loved him, and he went there and he helped him immediately. He didn't contemplate, oh, what do? I don't know what to do. He immediately went to him. At the scene of the crime, the Samaritan poured the oil and the wine, like I said, on his wounds, not a cheap commodity. The Samaritan did not have to do what he did, taking the man to the inn and leaving him there to heal. However, the Samaritan did what he knew was the right thing and went the extra mile, even though the man could have been his enemy. Could have been his enemy. But he took that chance, didn't he? Because he saw somebody in need and he loved them. It was his neighbor. It all goes back to the golden rule. We hear this a lot of times. Treat others as you would want to be treated, or as Jesus puts it, love your neighbor as yourself. So today, this morning, who is your neighbor? Who's our neighbor? According to Jesus, your neighbor is not just the person who lives next door to you. Everyone you run across is your neighbor. Everyone is your neighbor. That person who sits by himself at lunch, the guy who is treated differently because he is not like everyone else, that's your neighbor. The person who cuts you off in traffic is your neighbor. The person who has a differing political view than you is your neighbor. The homeless person on the corner is your neighbor. The beggar at Publix who messes up and begs everything the wrong way is your neighbor. The server who gets your order wrong is your neighbor. The person who willingly or unwillingly hurts you is your neighbor. That coworker who drives you nuts. Nobody has one of those? That's your neighbor. The person who bullies others, that bully is your neighbor. That person who says unkind things about you behind your back and gossips about you, that person is your neighbor. These people are the neighbors that Jesus is talking about. Just like back in the Bible, Jesus is still calling us to be a neighbor to those in need, to step into their mess, to be willing to sacrifice for them, and to love them regardless, hear this, We love them regardless of who they are or how they act or how they treat you. If we call ourselves Christians, which are followers of Christ, we're supposed to emulate and be like him. Everything we say and do is supposed to show people who Jesus Christ is. That means when somebody yells and attacks us, we don't reciprocate with the same thing. That means we are peacemakers. We show kindness in times like that. It doesn't mean you don't have a backbone. It doesn't mean having courage to stand up for yourself, but yet show kindness in times like that. That is being Christ-like. I can't think of any excuse or any scenario as a Christian where I would be justified to yell back at somebody and treat them unkindly. Not a single thing I can think of. We're not called to simply be nice to others or be neighborly, but we're also to love them. Go beyond respecting them as human beings. See them as God's masterpieces. It says in Scripture, we're all made in the image of God, correct? Then why do we pick and choose who we love? Why do we show hate to some people and others? They're all made in the image of God. We're all God's masterpieces. So why don't we treat each other like that? I don't care if the person doesn't agree with you. I don't care if the person's unkind to you. We show kindness and love. Jesus' teachings are radical. Because if we act like this, it will change lives. And I have a story in a few minutes that talks about this little girl that changed lives because she chose to be radical. As Christians, we are called to take that example and go out into the world, loving our neighbor and being willing to step into their lives and sacrifice our abilities and materials for them. Some of you might be sitting here this morning thinking it's impossible to love everyone, and you're right. In our own strength, we can't. It takes asking, accepting, and using the power of the Holy Spirit to be as radical as Jesus. Yes, Jesus' teachings are radical because they are so countercultural. Share this story. This happened to me last Monday. I had an unkind moment, and I love the Holy Spirit in my lives. Simple thing. Last Monday, it was raining a little bit. I went home, long day at church. It's my turn to grill. Jennifer's like, hey, the chicken's ready. I go out there, 10 minutes into it, propane's gone. All right, unscrew it, take it, put it in the truck, drive down to the gas station right around the corner. It's drizzling a little bit, so I have on my umbrella, and I get out and I walk in the gas station, which I go in there quite a bit. They know me. And I said, hey, big favor, can I get some propane? And the guy's like, sure, I'll call somebody out of the back. And I had an umbrella, and this man comes out. He's in full rain gear and an umbrella. I'm like, yes, I'm in luck. Awesome. And he looks outside and he goes, nope. I'm like, excuse me? No, I'm not going out there. And I was like, hey, we both have umbrellas, your rain gear, it'll be easy. He's like, no. And I went, what? Excuse me? And I went, whatever. Just like that. Turned around and walked out. Drove it down to Lowe's, got my tank of gas. Coming by the gas station, like God always does, he convicts me, and I'm like, I don't want to turn into this gas station, Lord. I'm fighting that wheel as hard as I can to go straight to my house. Turned in, walked inside, and I said, can I speak to the gentleman that came out earlier? He comes out, and I said, I owe you an apology. I was very unkind to you, and I need your forgiveness. And he looks at me, and he goes, all right, and he walks away. So I was like, okay, great. But I walked out with a smile on my face, and I'm not telling you the story to pat Bob on the back, but when you listen to the Holy Spirit, when the Holy Spirit convicts you to love thy neighbor, whoever that neighbor is, it leaves a smile on your face. It doesn't matter how the person reacted to me. Would I love him to give me a hug and go, oh, you're forgiven, this is the greatest day, I can't believe you came back, yay. No, it doesn't matter how he reacted to me. I was obedient to the Holy Spirit going, you weren't being neighborly to that stranger. Go back and make it right. That's radical Christianity. That's what we're called to do. I'm going to end you with this note that Taylor shared with me. It kind of hits the point. Peyton, this is a teacher writing to a parent of a grade school, an elementary school kid. Peyton did the most heartwarming act of kindness the other day. I just have to share with you. When she moved up in the super improver wall, the reward she chose was to sit with a friend at lunch. I thought for sure I knew who she'd pick, but she surprised me when she smiled and picked a little boy who never gets picked for anything. It made his day. Since that day, other children have started to pick him for things, and he is a completely different child because of it. All because of your daughter. Children learn to be kind by how they see kindness in their homes, so thank you. You are wonderful parents and are raising a little girl that will grow up to do amazing things. Peyton has reminded me why I love teaching kindergarten. That's radical love thy neighbor. That little girl can teach us so much. She could have easily stayed in her comfort zone and picked her best friends that she's always around, but she saw a neighbor in need. She saw a little boy who was lonely that nobody ever picks, and she chose to do that. It changed the whole character of that little boy. It changed the teacher. It made the teacher realize why she loves to teach kindergartens for moments like this. That little girl chose to love her neighbor. Are you a good neighbor?